First of all, hello everyone. Great to have you at CALRG. I'm Thomas Ullman. I'm a lecturer here in the Institute of Educational Technology, and I'm going to talk today about understanding student experience feedback of ethnic minority students with learning analytics, which was work basically mainly done by myself, but we had a lot of conversation by Chris Edwards, Andrew Brasher, Simon Cross went into that as well. Probably are all familiar with the awarding gap. The awarding gap between ethnic minority students and white students, which is basically that ethnic minority students get fewer top or good degrees than white students, and that even after controlling for various student characteristics. This is quite a persistent problem. What is not so known, but is probably equally important, is also that that students from an ethnic minority background are less satisfied with their student experience. And what I'm talking mostly today about is the student experience and how we can learn from students. So what you see here in the slides, and I'm sorry that it's a bit small, is basically that you can see from the NSS, which is a National Student Survey from 2005 to 2013, is that for all ethnic minority groups, we are less satisfied with the student experience. It seems that over the years, the gap is getting smaller, but it's still very persistent. It shows here overall satisfaction because it basically represents various different subscales from student surveys, such as teaching, learning opportunities, could be academic support, and so on and so forth. So it gives a good overview into the student experience. If you look now at the latest figures from the OFS, you can see that there is still a gap. So also after so many years, this gap really did not close. Ethnic minority students still are less satisfied than white students. Right. So what we can see from that type of data, from the quantitative data, which we get from the Likert scaled items, is usually only what areas we should look at. Right, to understand if there are certain problems for certain student groups. Right, what these quantitative items do not show us is why actually students are not satisfied. Right, for that we would need different data, and one source of data could be the qualitative data that we get from student surveys. So all the open-ended responses to the open-ended items of student surveys. And this is what this research tried to achieve, is to get a better understanding of the student experience by looking at the open-ended comments. There is some previous research on open-ended items. And here I pick the one from Holland and Site-Seva. See. So I hope you can see the table. What they basically did is they converted a corpus of 70,000 student comments on word level, and then they counted the frequency of each word for each of the minorities and the majority. And what they then did is, so the word that came on top of the most frequent, and then they gave a relevance to all subsequent words, right? So you can see here that certain words are more relevant for certain student groups than for others, right? So they highlighted, for example, so this is an example of how you can use text analytics to make sense of our student comments. And what you can see here is that, for example, they used the word interesting, which was mostly used with the same grade of relevancy for white and Asian students, but there is a drop for Black students. And they think that might be due to that Black students, are not using the word interesting in such a habitual way as maybe do white students to express that something or the contents have been interesting. We can also see that the word lecturer, for example, has a different relevance for Black students. So lecturer, the singular use of it. And they think that is due to, because when they inspected the comments, they see that Black students very often mention individual members of staff, especially to praise them or to express gratitude, right? And you can also see that, for example, coursework is quite relevant for them. Is relevant for Asian students. We not only looked at the most, let's say, most frequent words, we also had a look at if certain words are used in a different context. So here we have an example of a word needs, and when they looked what other words are associated with needs, and they looked at for each of the three groups. And here you can, for example, see that the word needs is mostly used by Asian students in the context of lecture delivery, and basically to highlight the importance of the need to have well-explained lecturers. These are two examples of how you can use text analytics to try to gauge some sense from student comments. Right, so this is what has been done by previous research. Let's have a look what we did. In our case, we worked with our end of module survey, which is the student experience of a module survey, which in version 2. So there's now a completely new version to which I have sort of a minor input. So we have now the new ISS, but the research is still ISS survey, but the research is still based on the old SEAM survey. You can see that it has 3 open-ended questions on which I focused. We then collected a large number of modules, and you will see why we needed 216 modules. It's basically because if you look then how many students commented on or left a comment, you can see that there is a stark difference between the amount of comment of white students and, in this case, Indian, Pakistani, African, or Caribbean students. Right, so to get a good data set, a large enough data set for ethnic minority students, you actually need quite a large data set. And then with that comes also the problem of how to deal with such a large data set. And that's where we embarked on text analytics to get a grip with that. Our method that we used is a 2-step approach. So what we did do a bit differently from the Site-Seva and Holland approach is that we used a log likelihood ratio, which basically shows for each word whether the word is significant relevant. It basically says if a word appears in one group, let's say in the ethnic minority group, and usually often compared to the comments in the white group, right? So what we basically look here is we look for each word. Is this word occurring unusually often in one group than the other? And if it does that, that basically says something that a specific group talks about it far more often than the other group. So this is something worth to look at. And what we then did is that once we have determined these keywords, we looked at the most significant ones, and then we did a manual content analysis. What we did is we basically filtered all comments that contain a keyword, keyword could be, for example, study support. And when we looked at each of those comments and derived themes for these comments doing thematic analysis. Right, so I can show you how such a log likelihood table looks like. So here we have the keywords for Caribbean students. And you see that all words are ordered by their keyness, with word colleague, which is basically the word that got so often mentioned by Caribbean students compared to white students that it bubbled up to the top of this list. So it's very unique that this is mentioned by those students. And you see that there are many words, but I'm going to focus on two of them now, and which is support and circumstances. And the reason is basically because they have been mentioned quite often by Caribbean students. So in this case, 31 students mentioned support, which is quite a percentage. It's probably around 10% of students who mentioned that word. And circumstances is also mentioned quite often. So these are words that are not only mentioned unusually often, are key for this group, but also they have been mentioned by a large proportion of our students. Right. Okay, so if you look at the keyword support and do the content analysis, we derive several themes. Mostly they use the word support in a context describing the help that was provided by tutors and other educational staff. So as help about the studies, to clarify questions about the study material and about the assessment. Well, 40 students, well, half of these 40 student comments expressed a positive sentiments. There was also a large group that described a need for more support. They're describing, for example, that there was a complete lack of tutorials, or there was a lack of assignment support or tutorials in general. So it was also a negative experience there. If we look at the keyword circumstances, we can see that often this word is used to describe personal circumstances, which could be health-related, family or work-related issues. And often these students describe consequences of those personal circumstances. So when they comment or talk about personal circumstances, is to outline that this led to struggles to keep up with the course, or that they had less time to prepare for assessment. Often they also mention barriers. So a barrier could be, for example, the extensive amount of reading materials, but also to help to overcome certain barriers where they mention enablers such as tutor support, which was important to deal with overcoming personal circumstances. Right, let's look at another keyword. Now we look at African students. I don't show the table, but there's also a list of keywords that came out for doing the analysis for African students, and support came on top as well. And here there's also a bit of a different emphasis than for the Caribbean students. So they also talked about it in more in a positive way. I think this is true for many of these. They first mentioned it and talk more positively about something, but then they also really talk about the negatives surrounding support, so that there were not enough tutorials, or there was lack of support, especially during the end of module assessments, or that certain sections did not have a tutorial, which we would have expected. Right, the second keyword is studies, which I want to highlight. So this is mostly used also again in a positive context to express the support by tutors and tutorials, but is also used to talk about how studies help them with personal growth, skills and attitude, and a generous sentiment towards, positive sentiments toward the student experience. But there's also, not to a lesser degree, but still often mentioned, they talked in the context of studies about issues with workload and a negative experience with tutorials again. We look at Pakistani students. One of the keywords that came up was TMAs, and that was often used to note that there was not enough time between assessments. So this could be an assessment between TMAs or between the TMA or the EMA. However, they often mentioned also problems with an assessment. This could be or highlighted problems around tutor support or around instructions. Is another keyword that was mentioned now here from Indian students. This is the fourth group I want to talk about, and they basically mentioned examples to report problems associated with certain elaborations of course materials, which are problems with examples explaining materials. They reported often that there was a lack of examples or not enough examples, but also that examples were not helpful for the assessment or that examples were too complex. So this is interesting because in the previous research from Site Seva, that was also mentioned that for Indian students, coursework is very important, and their examples are part of that. Right. So I just mentioned now a small set of keywords and showed you the results of the content analysis for those keywords. We did this for a couple of more keywords, and I will later show you the link to the report. But overall, we can see that Black and Asian students were generally positive about the student experience, but they also raised many critical points. So Caribbean students reported more often barriers to their study around workload, information overload, and a lack of support, but also about the impact of personal circumstances that led to struggles with the studies. African students mentioned more often workload issues and also complained about support via tutors and tutorials. Pakistani students criticized the lack of time between the assignments, and Indian students was this lack of examples. Right. Okay, so one thing doing this analysis was to see that compared to the closed-ended items, we can see that open-ended items can help to provide a deeper understanding of the student experience. So it's not only showing us areas to look at, but also in many cases help us to understand what exactly, went right or went wrong. So it helps us more answering a question why the student experience is so negative or so positive in that case. I think a particular strength of the text analytics is that if you do the keyword analysis first, these keywords are, determined with a statistical method. And this gives you a very principled approach to then detect which of the words you want to follow up with a content analysis. Right? So you have an approach that helps you to guide your attention for the content analysis. Well, what is important to see is that we actually need quite some large data set to generate these insights. And I think this is particularly important when working with ethnic minority students, because we have seen that only if we aggregate students, we get large enough numbers of students to do this type of analysis, but basically any type of statistical analysis. And I think one of the big questions is now that that we can now use more text analytics to derive insights. So the question then, how can that information, or that new source of information, how can this be used then to actually inform course improvement? There is the full story is on our scholarship exchange. If you search for my name, you very easily find it there. Of course, if you have any feedback, also after the session, I'm very happy to talk about this with you.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. So for the ones that I didn't have the opportunity to meet yet, I'm Koula Charitonos. I'm based in IT. I'm a senior lecturer there. And alongside wonderful colleagues, and as I said, Fidele and Mahlea are with us today. We have been working on a project that examines transitions to open and distance education for students with refugee backgrounds. So you can see all the colleagues that have been involved in the project here. Even though it's just the three of us today, colleagues, of course, couldn't attend here due to other commitments, but this is by no means not only our work. So the Open Future Sanctuary Scholarship Program at the OU is a new and a very hopeful development at the Open University and supports students from refugee backgrounds. So what we are hoping to do today is to really give a very brief overview of the scheme and also outline our project. We're going to share some micro portraits with you from students, and then really use these micro portraits to synthesize some of the data and really talk about themes and tensions. And there are specific findings and recommendations that we are making to the university. But before we start, I would like to pass it over to Fidele. And Fidele is going to talk to us about the wider context when it comes to displacement. Fidele, over to you.
Thank you, Koula. It's Fidele here from Open University Business School and the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership, just to plug where I'm coming from. And I'm very sure you are very familiar with some of the figures you can see on the screen. We will not be going through all those figures, but it is very important to remind everyone that recent images, particularly in the Mediterranean a couple of weeks ago, when there was a shipwreck taking the lives of so many refugees and asylum seekers, I think it brought home the message that we are in this together. It's not only about them, it's also about us. And as you can see, there is this big figure of 180 million. I don't know if it was a country in the world, how big this country would be. I leave it to you to think about it and ask yourselves, okay, so what are we doing? What part are we playing to make sure that this world is good for us? Unfortunately, millions of people are fleeing because of violence, war, persecution, oppression, and other human rights violations. And very soon, I think we'll be seeing many people being displaced by environmental changes, which are happening because of global warming. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the numbers of refugee asylum seekers, as you can see on the chart, are increasing on a yearly basis, more or less. So we have seen crises like the Syrian refugee crisis, Afghanistan, most recently in Ukraine. And as you know, there is a lot of things happening in the likes of Sudan, and I'm very sure there'll be a lot of implications, and the neighboring countries, as you can imagine, suffer the most, but some of those might end up here. So just to say that, we are in this together. It's not only about them or the neighboring countries, it's also about society at large. The next one, please. The biggest challenge, obviously, because we are talking about education, is that many of refugees and internally displaced people, some of them may be in those internally displaced people refugee camps for up to 26 years. And many of the refugees and asylum seekers, internally displaced people, don't get a chance to participate in education. Yes, they can get on with their lives, they can thrive in their environment, but education, as far as from my own personal lived experience, is key to opening many doors of opportunities. The reasons why there is no access to education or limited access is to do with, there are very few opportunities for third level education. Even those who get in, they have to face the challenge of tuition fees, living expenses, having to forego paid work when you have to restart life to attend university, but also the problem of getting documentation to evidence prior communications. No wonder only 6% of refugees have access to third level education. Can we move to the next one? I should have mentioned that the UN, based on the slides you have just seen, has got a target of 15% by the year 2030. I wonder what we'll be saying in about 7 years' time. Maybe we can revisit the slide then. The next one, please. So obviously, coming closer to home, there are a few activities taking place in the UK through the various courses, and universities are doing things, but are we doing enough? I would say we are not doing enough. But if the Ukrainian refugee crisis is anything to go by, actually we have the capacity to do more. It's just a matter of getting the goodwill and also funding the goodwill. Can we move to the next one? Yeah, so the Open University itself, we have 2 schemes. We have got set of scholarship for undergraduate study, and we have got few waivers for access programs. And we'll be talking about what we have been doing with those students on doing undergraduate studies, as well as those who are on access programs. Koula will be going through what we have been doing. And finally, as my contribution, there are opportunities for postgraduate education in a program run by King's College in London for people from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And I know we have time constraints. Over back to you, Koula. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fidele. And as I said, it is a very hopeful development, really, what is happening at the OU, and raises the role that universities can play in this global challenge of access to quality education for forcibly displaced people. So our project is situated within the Open Future Sanctuary Scholarships Program. It started back in October, and it is funded by the OU through a cross-faculty scholarship scheme. So there is really a growing knowledge and growing understanding of how students experience their transitions into and through university. However, there isn't really much about the barriers and enablers students from refugee backgrounds have, particularly when we talk about studies online and at a distance. So we wanted to examine really the students' experiences of studying at the OU, the support that the OU offered to them, the challenges they may face. But a big part of the project is to really offer recommendations to the OU really with regards to the existing program and how this could be improved, and how this could lead to better outcomes really for students. So in the project, we are using a model that has been developed by Marin Gillespie and colleagues at the OU through previous projects. It is a multi-stakeholder model. It is collaboratively developed, and it is developed over time. So it builds on ethnographic approaches and it identifies value components of each key stakeholder group that has some stakes in this scheme. Essentially, what the model and what we're trying to do is what success looks like from the perspective of the stakeholders. And we have identified 3 key stakeholders in the university. Of course, it's the senior management, which includes the Vice Chancellor's Office. Some of these developments are led by the Vice Chancellor's Office, is the scholarship program and any initiatives that are related to sanctuary, to the OU becoming a university of sanctuary, are sponsored by the NDI Vice Chancellor, Marcia Wilson. Of course, it contributes to access and participation success. So, and that's why you can see the various groups within the senior management. There is also the operational team, which includes ALs, tutors, personal learning advisors, academic services, academics and researchers, of course, but also the development office, who is involved in the fundraising, and of course the students. And just to say that the model is work in progress, is being in development as we speak. And we won't stay long in this. I can go through this in detail if you would like me to, but just for the sake of moving on to the data, I'm going to skip the slides about the value components. In terms of the methods that we followed, there was various activities that happened through the year. This includes lots of meetings with EDI, with APS teams, academic services, development office. We organized drop-in sessions for students. We organized monthly academic skills sessions with students. Of course, most of us are also members of the Sanctuary Advisory Network at the Open University, and we have regular meetings, weekly meetings. And there has been lots of email communication that is happening as part of our engagement in these initiatives. More formally, there have been interviews with students back in February, but also now in June. So these are the same students repeated interviews in 2 key points of the year. But we are also we have also done interviews with tutors, but also student support team. And students are at the center of this work. And we saw that our students are really figuring out how to be a student, ways to learn, ways to be an online student, and how to foster relationships of learning, how to mobilize networks of support. And we learned from them how they create these spaces for learning, how they create trust, how they forge trust. And the study, as I said, was about the students. And we are really inspired by this work by Sarah Dreisen-Peterson and Hania Marian at the Harvard School of Education and colleagues, and work that they have done with educators in context of forced migration and context of conflict. And they have used this method, which is about micro-portraits, creating micro-portraits of educators. And we wanted to draw on this to highlight some stories, some opportunities, some challenges that our students have through presenting to you some micro-portraits, by really spending time with students this year, and by also engaging with all these methods. And of course, we are also mindful that you might have not met the students. So that's why we would like to really start with these micro-portraits. And we're going to use the stories to synthesize and unpick some themes and tensions, as we call them. So student 1 is from Ukraine and arrived in the UK in March 2022. She currently lives in the north of England. I came here and I didn't have anything, she said. She used to be a lawyer in Ukraine, but upon her arrival in the UK, she realized, oh, I can't be a lawyer here because another half of my life is just going to studying. It is sometimes really important to invest money in studying. It is sometimes very difficult to invest money in studying. It is very important, but when you have so many problems around you, you just don't think that it is the best way. She added, I want to build a life here. She wants to have a degree and change her profession. She never thought she could study in the UK. Studying now in England, wow, I couldn't be happier. The scholarship offers me just a future when I don't have anything. Student 2 is from Southeast Asia. He currently lives in Wales. As a person seeking asylum in the UK, he had nothing to do and no job. He felt like life was useless here. I was in zero, he said. I love to study. Back in his country, he had a career as an intelligence analyst. I have a bachelor's degree and I was studying for a master's as well, but I couldn't finish it. He applied for the scholarship with a plan to study criminology. However, he was told early on, no, you can't do the criminology due to being an asylum seeker. So then I turned to the health sector. He said, it is a good sector in the UK. There are a lot of job opportunities and I want to build up my new career. How can I tell you that? This is my dream. It is like the best thing in my life, the scholarship. I grabbed it by both hands. It is a big thing for me. Student 3 is from West Africa. He has been in the UK for 12 years as an asylum seeker. He initially applied for a full scholarship because he wanted to do a degree in politics, philosophy, and economy. Unfortunately, I was not lucky enough to have the full scholarship, he said. It has been a disappointment. He was given the chance to study the access module. I'm still hoping to do the same degree. He was agonizing over the subject he chose in the access program, but in hindsight, when I got into it, I've already done the work, and all I have to do is to go back to it, apply that to what I'm doing, and then it's going fine. Only last year, he said he applied to more than 10 universities. But maybe God wanted me to come to the Open University, and I think I found myself the right place to be. Student 4 is from Ukraine. She lives near London. She has a background as a teacher and a specialty as a sports coach. Other than a master's degree, she also has a university diploma as a marketing manager. I'm constantly studying, she said. I am very fond of arts. I used to go to the English theater in Ukraine, and I'm in languages. So I have chosen this specialty. The main motivation is to improve my language. I just want to write more fluently, more freely. She currently has a job in a school, so improving language skill helps me to work with the British children. In terms of her goals, I'm here and I have this opportunity to study. I will need all this knowledge. When I come back to Ukraine, I would be able to open my school and to teach. And I just managed to enter in the university, and I'm just so happy and pleased. And well, I just try to do them best, just to study in proper way. So in all the interviews with the students, and just thought that this is quite early stages because we just completed the data collection with them, we can see some critical events in the micro level of their studies. And this is related to finding out information about the scholarships, the application process, really registration, but also we can't really underestimate other critical events, other life events that are happening and are intertwined with these events in the micro level, and they shape them and they inform them and then disrupt them or accelerate really their studies. So I will go through some examples for each of these events just to highlight some points. When it comes to the application process, that seemed to be very clear, really, without really major glitches. It was quite straightforward, as the first student says in this slide, but it is still not neutral. It is still emotionally loaded. It could be really scary for someone, as we see in the second quote here. And remember that people who are forcibly displaced, they really have to fill in forms all the time. So even an application form that can be straightforward, at the same time, it can raise lots of emotions. Having gone through this process and having got a letter which says, congratulations, you are offered the scholarship or you are offered the fee waiver, this was a very intense period for them, a period which was full of uncertainty and a period that major decisions have to be made. There were at least 15 students who actually did not accept the university's offer to study for the access modules, but all students accepted the full scholarship. One of our students really agonized over the decision and the selection of the access module, and students really need to make informed decisions. So as you can see, he says, I was so confused. I have to make sure this module is a good one. And this is the student who applied in 10 universities, and we are going to see more of his story in the next slides. One of our scholarship students also confused, but also the student really, as I said, couldn't really study what he wanted. And the degree is really an important decision, and he cannot be making light decisions, especially considering that for all the students, pathways to employability, pathways to employment are really essential. There was lots of support. There was lots of emails, calls by colleagues, tutors, student support teams, academic services, all kinds of services in the university really offering help, which was greatly appreciated by the students. But I think when we go to the registration, you know, students have made some decisions, they're settling in their studies, and that's kind of like another critical event that we should be paying more attention to. So when I'm going to use the story from the second student, so we can see that the OU was quite proactive. As part of the scholarships, they have offered equipment to the students. They have offered really the laptop, the printer, the internet connection data, which are essential for actually using in their studies. But there were so many unknowns to them, like the library, uploading assessments, booking tutorials, and that was quite a steep curve for these students. But this student is using all kinds of resources and networks in the university. He's taking part in the personal learning advisory sessions, the PLA sessions. He's doing the Open Learn courses because he's still interested in criminology, because that is what he wanted to study. He's taking part in the academic skills sessions, and also he's using the Wellbeing app from the Open University. And just in the same kind of like critical event, this student one highlighted that all you can see in that first phase is really a website with lots of information, and you cannot really digest this information. It doesn't feel real, as she says. Let alone that students are constantly worried. Have they missed anything? Didn't they notice something important? So one of the suggestions she's making is to have a gathering in the early days of the studies. And a really similar suggestion from her student to have a video call. I think the OU is using, and because this is the access module in the access program, they regularly have the phone calls with the tutors, but the student is really asking for a video call so you can have a human face in front of you, because also all you can see is papers and pages and phone numbers, and if you see someone, it really calms you down. So when it comes to assessment, there is really nothing surprising. It's quite predictable things, really feeling very proud about their marks, and they are all doing remarkably well, it seems. They were sharing the marks that they got in the interviews. They were highlighting support they were getting from the tutors. And of course, talking about lots of feelings of feeling upset or feeling disappointed and pride. But also it's kind of like expected things for students. And it's quite reassuring because, as you can see in this quote, the tutor said, if you want, just send me a message and we can talk more about this. So I think all these kind of like gestures, all these kind of like relationships that are being built, and then the responses from tutors really help them to overcome some of these emotions. And of course, in all the conversations and all the interactions we have with the students, there is a future they are imagining, and something that will come next, and something that will be better than what they have now. And this might be a change in profession, this might be a change in status, better life situations, but also in the micro level of OU studies, there is some uncertainty among the students whether the approach and the support that they got this year is going to continue. While the second student, who is an access student, really wants to apply for a scholarship and do a degree in philosophy and economics. And the question for us is, are we creating pathways for the students to actually progress in their studies? And I'm going to complete the talk with some thoughts that we have really, and to highlight that sanctuary students and students from refugee backgrounds are not really a homogeneous group. There isn't a single experience. Some of the things that you heard, I think you might be thinking that they're quite common, and that's this is what we think as well. Students have different cultural backgrounds, they have different educational backgrounds, different work experiences, languages, skills, but also even the length of their time in the UK, accommodation situations, maybe it's what Thomas called earlier circumstances, different displacement experiences, different life situations. Some of them are with families, some of them are without families. But I think we all agree that this group has the lived experience of conflict and displacement, and they are in a context where there is lots of uncertainty, there is lots of instability, and there are lots of dependencies. I think what we see is that the OU experience, the student experience, is really shaped in these micro moments, because someone ranked them, because someone talked to them in the proper way, because someone was kind, because someone really calmed them down. At the same time, and I'm drawing on a discussion we had in a recent CALRG session with Martin Oliver, where he talked about the macro gestures at the institutional level, and they do really matter. In our case, it is about the provision of equipment, for example. It is about offering some flexibility with assignments. And it's always in relation to others. And relationships are really, really, really paramount. And we have seen really substantial evidence of this in the interviews we were doing with the tutors as well. There is a range of important others in the conversations we had with the students. And this is beyond the OU. Students were amazing in actually reaching out to people, mobilizing support and networks, and try at all times to make informed decisions and use the resources appropriately. And this is less about the OU and really more about the students individually mobilizing this network. So we can see the first student was ready to give up. But then because of the connections that he had with this charity and the manager giving him the information about the Open University Scholarship, he gave it a go. And he got the fee waiver for the access module. The second student is well embedded in this community group in Wales, and they have study support. And there is also a specific person, a professor, as he says, that offers this support to him, and there is a group in place that really helps him. And it is really an emotional journey for them, and there's an emotional toll in every single of these phases. And even when, as an institution, we have really good intentions, like in the example of the student, because the OU had a process in place to actually give the equipment to the student, our processes may bring some emotions that we underestimate. And in the case of the student, she was really scared to go to the bank and give invoices and give all this information, and she didn't do it. But she was lucky enough because she had a host family who really provided lots of support to her, but maybe other students don't have this support. And just to conclude, our students really are dealing with lots of unknowns and lots of uncertainties in their lives. And I think you will probably think, aren't we all? Aren't all our students living with this uncertainty? But I think this is an acute level. I had an interview with a student who said a letter from the Home Office can break you. So I think it is at an acute level. And just consider the student who is in the asylum system for 12 years. This is a very precarious situation. And maybe through some of the processes and procedures and structures we have, maybe we, without intending to do so, maybe we're reinforcing these uncertainties. Some of the students are newcomers in the countries. There are lots of perceptions among people about what is expected from them, what's appropriate, what is possible. But also, I think it's a reminder to us that studying at a distance is a big unknown at the stage of the application, but even later on. What does it mean for students, especially if you come from a country where online learning, distance learning is not valued, is not accepted as a valid form of education? And even working with a tutor is a really big unknown to them. And that's why we saw in the interview this idea of having like video calls and having the meetings, which were really valued by the students. So what we're sharing here are really some first thoughts, some ideas we have about the data. We have used evidence from the data that is associated with these 4 students with their micro-portraits, but these are not really outliers in our data set. It is quite representative of what we have gathered. And there were a range of findings and recommendations that we are currently making to the university. And we can see that the sanctuary program is really receives high level of appreciation from students, from staff, but other stakeholders at the university. And it really extends the OU's widening access and participation initiatives and really speaks to the OU social justice mission. We can say that it's functioning very well and really builds on services that are already in place. Some elements of this program are owned by different units, and this creates some fragmentation in the program, but also to highlight that it relies a lot on the relational work and really existing expertise, especially among members of staff. And I'm going to just stop with the recommendations. I think I can see Shelley coming along. And just to say thank you very much for listening. We have spoken a lot. Please ask us questions. And please also share with your networks the call for the scholarships, because it's still open until the 12th of July. And please visit this resource that we have created on the OpenLearn platform, the OpenLearn Sanctuary Hub, which has created resources really drawing on needs among students from refugee backgrounds. Thank you very much.
This is a European project, which Erasmus Plus project. It's led by the Open University of Catalonia, or the foundation that supports that part of the university, and it's ending this July with the final report due in September. So this is the first time. It's the first time I brought all the data together to reflect on it, and so it's the first time of sharing it with anyone as well, and you'll see there's some more thinking that we need to do, but this is where we are. There's several universities involved, obviously the Open University of Catalonia and 2 universities in Portugal, University of Valencia and Barcelona, Bourgogne in France, and us in the UK. The original intention was to have an online institution and a face-to-face institution in each country, and that was achieved in Spain and Portugal, but not France, which is just face-to-face, and not here either. There was a university, I think it was York, but for whatever reason, they felt they had to drop out before the project started. So the motivation for the project, I think in terms of the Open University of Catalonia, who initiated this and built this submission, they were really reacting to changes in the higher education system within Spain, where their quality assurance agency had introduced new measures to improve the widening participation for higher education. And that led them to think about how to support students more during their study, and what the experience of those students were during their study. It also ties in with the idea of the Bologna Agreement, where we agreed with the European Union to improve transparency and improve the alignment between higher education throughout Europe, so that students would more easily move between, which I think has still got some way to go from what I understand, but that's really their motivation. For us, over the last few years, we've become increasingly aware that there's an enormous complexity when we try and look at gaining an understanding of our students' experience, that we've tended in the past to wrap a whole load of things up together, and find that then makes it difficult to form any conclusions. So we've tried to been trying to unpick this, and this was an ideal opportunity to explore a couple of new methods and see where that gets us. If those that have seen the next 2 or 3 slides can bear with me, not everyone will have done, and it just helps explain the context. That within the OU, we obviously have, we're open to everyone, and we have no entry requirements for our undergraduate program. Students can just come in and we do what we can to provide materials to support them, and we have the access route in, which is really helpful for many students. But that makes us different from very many universities. We also are in a situation where students who are paying for their study with loans from the student loans company have to declare a qualification that they're aiming for in order to get the loan. But we as an organisation don't enforce students to declare any study intention to us, and we allow students to change their study intention anyway, even when they do declare it. And when they do declare it, they can say they're studying for more than one qualification. Some say they're studying for 3, and that obviously complicates things on its own for us. And students are therefore able to study more or less the modules they choose to study, and when they choose them, and when they choose to study them, so the presentation they choose. We've got student support teams, we've got other people that are there to provide advice and guidance on choices, but it's fundamentally down to the student. And so quite often we only know what qualification a student is studying for when they've actually accepted it. So at the very end of all their study, and when they've been offered, they may have been offered more than one qualification that they've essentially achieved through their study, and they get to choose which they take in that case. And then we know which degree they've actually studied for. But we do have some idea along the way through their declarations where they make those. So we offer the open degree as well, which is still our largest degree in terms of numbers graduating, and that offers the potential for students to create their own program of study. So we find that whenever we start to explore students' study, it gets very complicated very quickly. And just as an example, the work that we'd been doing before, this is just a plot of one cohort studying one key introductory module in one presentation. And so there are around 1,000 students on this module. And this is a plot of the next module they went on to study after that, and there's 55 different modules. So we see that those 1,000 students, obviously not all of them went on to study another module anyway, but those that did, there were 55 different routes that they separated into right from that start. And if you count the numbers in each of those transitions to a module, then you get and arrange it in order. We get a plot which is down in the bottom. And we see that the vast majority of students are concentrated in just a very small number of routes, but then we have a very long tail with some students on different, represented on lots and lots and lots of different transitions. So that's a feature that we see over and over again. If we then do the same thing, but look at that same cohort and follow them on for, I think, 5 extra steps of study, which in most cases would enable them to, if they're at 60 credits a step, if they were successful, they'd achieve 360 credits. And if we visualize that in a plot like this, it's too tangled to make any sense of, but we can see that. And we get the same kind of diagram, a plot. If we plot it, we end up with an extremely high peak in this case, and then it tails off very quickly. But with a very significant proportion of our students are in that long tail. So we wouldn't want to ignore that whenever we think of student experience. So that's one place we've got to. We can try and simplify that and make these visualizations more useful, or an analysis more useful. If we just say, let's filter that and think of just including all those transitions where at least 10 students have made that transition. And so now we start to see a picture which is something that we can interact with, and we can start to look at the kind of choices students are making here. So visualization is something that I think will have a place, and we're still working out how to best to use that. And if we can do it in a way that's interactive, then that becomes a much more powerful tool as well. So all that work's ongoing. But then we moved into this complex trajectories project, and that has 2 strands. And one strand is about the practices that universities are engaged with in terms of bringing students in, of helping them make their choices, helping them move from one qualification to another, and perhaps of how they recognize credit when you come in from another institution. So that's part of the complexity is students moving between institutions. And so those practices form one strand, and that within the project has turned into a MOOC where it's not quite released yet, which is why I can't share it. And it will contain a description and a review of these practices with support materials to help those that are involved in student admission and in supporting students to that there'll be a set of materials that will help them understand what's going on elsewhere and maybe impact on their own work. I'm not going to talk about that strand anymore, because the strand I was involved with was to do with the data analysis. And so I'll go straight onto this slide. I'll take some time on this, so I won't go off this quickly. But what we did, we tried two different methods. One was sequence analysis, where we set some criteria and we coded for those criteria, and then we grouped all the students into the same groupings and following the same sequences through those criteria and made these plots. So if I just have a go at talking us through these, because they look different on the face of it, but if we look at the four plots on the left-hand side to start with, we've got green at the bottom, and that green bar gradually increases as we go through time. And in the case of the three of those four, which look very similar, they're all for the Spanish universities. The two at the top are the face-to-face universities, the Catalan face-to-face. So they said Catalan because they were able to have all the data for all the Catalan face-to-face universities, which is obviously really useful. And then the University of Valencia, which was obviously not in Catalonia. And then the Open University of Catalonia down the bottom. And we can see that, and I put us in the middle at the bottom. Ours is slightly different, and I'll talk about the differences in a second. But so that those green elements are where students are not studying. Now, in Spain, they categorize those as not in higher education. For us, I only felt comfortable categorizing them as not studying, because students can always come back and study with us. And but at the time, they weren't studying. So that increases, and we see for the Open University, those green bars are higher throughout than for the others. So we have a higher proportion of the students that begin, and this, I should have said at the outset, is for 2012-13 cohorts. So that's the first cohort in a new funding regime. So that made sense to pick them, and it was all the data until the point where it was collected. So it was up to about the beginning of 2001, I think. So it's quite a few years that we were able to call on. And then the next feature of those four plots is the top right-hand corner, which has a kind of reddish or lilac, if you look at the Spanish ones, colouring. And that they're the students that gain their degree, gain their qualification. And so we see that increasing over time for all of them. And slightly longer it takes to increase in the distance universities, the ones at the bottom, the two at the bottom, and then at the top. And then we have the orange sections, which are those indicating study. So that's where students have studied in that particular year, and that shows it gradually decreasing over time as some students drop out continually, or as some students gain their degrees. In a couple of the Spanish institutions, well, actually in all of those, they also included, because they had it to hand in the data, they included where students went on to study for masters, but that was something they added on later on. So that's there. If I just talk about a little bit about the difference in our data, our plot at the bottom, there's more columns for a start, and that was because it was initially decided to go into semesters. So I'd coded all our data into semesters, 2 semesters in an academic year, and that you can see for us that we've got a kind of peak and a trough as you go through each year. But that was partly because by doing that, we also made the decision that I should only include the students that started in semester 1 in the first semester at the beginning of the academic year, and follow those through. So they would have started. That first bar has got a lot of orange, showing there's a lot of study. And then the second bar has a lot of green, because a lot of students that studied in the first semester weren't studying in the second, but they had studied in the whole year. So that I also introduced other codings, and so working down that list, we had not studying. I'd included studying or started but not completing a module, completing a module, and then the yellow one was starting multiple modules but not completing all of them. I thought that was probably a greater effort. And then blue was completing multiple modules. So that there are all sorts of combinations that we can have, and I wasn't sure how that would fall out in terms of the analysis and the plot. In the event, we can see that they're there, but they're very small portions of the plots. If we move to the other plots, the two plots for Porto, face-to-face university in Portugal, and Bourgogne in France, then they're kind of inverted. So in these, we've got the students are studying, which are the blue or the purple, and that's in the bottom. So that gradually decreases through time. And we've got the proportion that have essentially left and they're no longer enrolled, and they're the bars at the top, grey for Porto and orange for France. And then the middle section is the increase in the numbers of gaining qualifications, their degrees. And for France, they were able to include their graduate degree as well. So that's the green section within that. So if we look at that, they're actually, I mean, there's the same trends in all of them, but to different extents. So it's clear that we suffer the largest dropout after the first year, but the trend overall is that dropout decreases year on year for every institution, and so on. So there's some patterns there, and that was one analysis that we undertook. And then the next one, so I ought to summarize the findings. So summarizing those, so there are slightly different categorizations, as I tried to explain, and that results in the plots looking a bit different. For example, we've used not studying, as I said, and whereas they've used different wordings in the others because it means something slightly different as well. I've said every institution shows largest dropout in the first year, and that gradually decreases. Obviously, students in face-to-face institutions tend to graduate earlier, and that's reflected in these plots as well. Should just remind myself or us all that Portugal, France, and the UK degrees are normally 180 ECTS points equivalent, and that's or equivalent to 3 full-time years of study for those face-to-face ones. And in Spain, it's generally 240 ECTS points and 4 years. So they're not directly comparable because of that. And so that's something to take into account as well. So that was one strand of data analysis. The other strand that we undertook was to do with group-based trajectory modeling. And this is generally used in medicine to see how long someone's going to survive with cancer, for example, or to see the effects of particular drugs. And there's all sorts of factors you can pull into that. And so the idea of that is that you apply this to your data to reveal hidden or latent groups within the data. And so we've done this, and the 4 other institutions there, where their plots all look very similar in the way in which they're plotted, they all use the same tool within Stata. We didn't have Stata to hand, and there wasn't budget for it, and we were using R generally for the data. So, and there's packages for doing group-based trajectory modeling in R. So I thought it made sense for us to approach it through that route. But it does mean that it looks a bit different, and it means I'm still interpreting the results. And part of me thinks I wish I'd asked for, well, I wish I'd asked for us to buy Stata and just done it the same. But that's a reflection on the whole project, really. But so we've got these plots, and again, there's some similarities between them. And if we look at they all tend to have a line drawn across, or a line at the top that's close to horizontal and high up, and that's interpreted as students that are studying well and getting on with the study and achieving their degrees. And at the other end, at the bottom, there's a very steep drop off for a curve, and that shows students that drop out very quickly. And in the middle, there's generally 2 or 3 other curves showing other groups that maybe started off well and then tailed off in their study and struggled and dropped out maybe, or just gradually made it through, but not as strongly as the top group. And if we look at the 3 plots on the left-hand side, so WOC, as they say, UAB and the OU, we've only got 3 lines on the OU, but that's because I had to take out all the students that drop out after the first year, and that was just because it completely dominated the analysis. And so I took those out and said they're a single group, that we know that they're a group, and let's look at all those that go on and study further and see what happens to them. And so although we've got 3 lines plotted, there is a 4th line, which I have to work out how to put it on, but that would be the very steep drop-off. And so we've got those, and so there's 4 for the University of Catalonia, 4 lines, 4 groups, and for us there's 4 groups. We both have large numbers of students within the data. For the UAB, they've identified 3 groups, but if you look, their confidence levels are very wide, and essentially this is because they've got 160 students that they were able to do that with. That was the only data they had that they could use for this was those students studying the degree in education. So they may well have 4 groups if we looked at more data, but that's where it is at the moment. For the 2 face-to-face universities, so the 2 on the right, there's at least 1 more group, and oh no, sorry, there's 5 groups, sorry, and what they've identified here as well, that there tends to be underneath the group that seems to perform or cope very well with study, there's another group which seems to improve over time, and they characterize this as the group of students that begin their study and to start with are struggling to adapt to university study, but gradually get in their stride and get into the groove. And then there's obviously groups that start off well and then struggle and might drop out later. So that is in a nutshell where we are on that data analysis. As a team, we've got to reflect on this and really interpret this in terms of our own students and our own data. But there are similarities between those universities which are valuable to look at as well. So that's where we are there. And I've summarized these findings here, so I won't read that, but I'll give us a moment just to check that that's what I have said. Okay, and yeah. Oh, and the other point, that the last one here, is that the wider confidence limits, where there's a large number of students, those wider limits might well indicate that the group isn't completely homogeneous. It's quite a heterogeneous group, and so that could be another element that we need to consider as well. So if I just move on, talk about the next steps. So we're obviously at a point where we need to finalise these results and the interpretations, what they mean for us as an institution, whether there's anything that we can do as a result of these. There's a dissemination event that we've got next week, actually, next Thursday, which we'll look at all of this in more detail and consider the practice, the whole of the good practices side of the project. I put the link there if anyone feels inclined to join. You'd be most welcome, particularly if you have an affiliation to another university, and you can use that email to register, because it will help with our numbers for external participants. But there's a final report, obviously, we need to work on over the summer and finalise through September, and look at papers that we can develop as a result of this, but also to see how this work can fit into what we are doing, looking at data and looking at the student experience within the university. It looks like the sequence analysis was useful in making some initial comparisons, but this group-based trajectory modelling and finding the latent classes within the student groups might well be quite informative, and there might be ways of extending that and improving that for the future.
Just like to say, I'm Jake Hilliard, working in learning design, and today my talk will be about creating emotionally supportive learning environments when undertaking assessed online group activities. So the talk will be split into kind of two main parts. The first part, I'll just give an overview of my PhD work, which looked at students' emotional experiences in these type of activities. And then the second part will focus on ways to maybe create more supportive environments, kind of focusing on students' emotions. Okay, so I guess historically emotions were neglected in kind of education, often focusing more on cognitive factors. But I guess over the last 20, 25 years, there's been this substantial body of work which started to really explore the impact of emotions and how they have an important influence on learning and students' achievement. So this research has highlighted that emotions can have an impact on students' memory processes, looking at an influence on students' learning strategies, choice of learning strategies, their cognitive resources, so attention and focus, and also motivational processes. Alongside that, obviously, emotional experiences throughout the learning experience can have, a significant impact on students' mental and physical well-being. And like I said at the start, this body of research has, highlighted the impacts of the emotion students experience throughout their kind of learner journeys and their impact on performance and achievement. I'll just add some context to the type of group learning I'm talking about, because I know there's lots of different ways students can interact and kind of that social learning whilst learning online. So I'm kind of focused on group activities which require students to work together in small groups to create some type of product, output, or artifact. So typically students will be separated into groups where they'll interact using asynchronous communication, predominantly at the OU, but also using synchronous methods. And they can also interact with a tutor during this time. I guess that's quite varied in how that happens, and maybe it would depend on the kind of structure of the module and the activity itself. And yeah, when students are working together, they can generate ideas. They can then share those ideas with one another and organise those in a certain way. And then hopefully there'll be some convergence of knowledge, and that can be then displayed in their output of their work, product, artifact. Obviously, that might not always happen. There might be occasions where groups start working quite cooperatively and split the work up, or students may drop out, so there can be reduced chance for collaboration. But each of the projects I looked at for my PhD was aimed at kind of fostering that collaboration. And there are other opportunities during these group activities where individual students might speak to the tutor, where students might speak to other students in other groups, and where groups might speak to each other for kind of peer assessment purposes. Like I said, in these group activities, there'll be some product created at the end. That might be some sort of essay, blog, website, and that will be assessed. And that mark will then be contribute to the overall module grade for a student. And that will be made up of both group marks and individual marks. So for the PhD, I kind of had 4 main research questions. I wanted to explore, the type of emotion students were experiencing. From reading around the area and speaking to people before I started my PhD, these activities were, had quite a mixed opinion. There was often some negative thoughts about the activities, and staff members sometimes thought students didn't really like them that much. Also wanted to understand the causes of emotions, research in the area, especially in kind of group learning context, focused in kind of computer supported collaborative learning environments, but not really distance learning contexts. Wanted to understand, the impacts of these emotions on students' participation and their performance in the activities, and also, how did students regulate their emotions, and why did they do that? Okay, so kind of my PhD consisted of like a mixed methods program. So there's 3 closely related studies hoping to answer those 4 research questions. So study 1, there was kind of this snapshot survey sent out after students completed a group activity, assessed group activity in 5 modules. That went out to those students, and there was 294 students who responded to the survey, and they were both qualitative and quantitative responses students could provide. The next study was a diary-based study where students completed an entry at certain points throughout one group activity, and I wanted to build on kind of the previous study. Instead of having that one time point where I tried to get students' responses, I wanted to have that over time to see if there was differences in how students reported their responses and the emotional experiences, but also to be a bit closer to actually when they might have been experiencing certain emotions. And then the third study, I also wanted to gain kind of a tutor perspective. So work prior to doing my PhD research, I've understood that tutors played an important role in students' emotional experiences in these activities, as well as, lots of other areas of study, but, they were a cause of emotion during the group activities. They're also a real big support for managing and regulating emotion. So I thought getting their perspectives would also be really useful. And I did that using discussion forum threads and semi-structured interviews. So in my first study, I kind of tried to explore, the dominant emotions experienced by students. So I asked students to report the emotions they'd experienced before, during, and after the group activities they just completed. And there were 2,317 emotion words reported, so just under 100 specific emotions were found. Some of these you might say were maybe other psychological conditions, but as students had reported them as emotions and they'd been reported as emotions in other literature, it was counted as an emotion in this work. And the main emotions that were kind of reported by students were anxiety, relief, and frustration. There was also kind of this journey throughout the group activity. So beforehand, there was more unpleasant emotions reported. There was that predominance of anxiety in students and fear. Then during the activities, there was more frustration, and after the activity, there was kind of more pleasant emotions. So satisfaction, happiness, relief. It's classified as a pleasant emotion, but obviously it might be related to kind of the end of the anxiety or frustration that students were experiencing. But there was a mix of pleasant and unpleasant emotions throughout, but there was this tendency to have stronger feelings of unpleasant emotions before and during, and more pleasant emotions after. This is kind of shown in this little figure I put on the screen. So kind of a traditional trajectory of emotions, kind of as students went throughout these different activities. Even though the activities were different themselves, there was kind of this consistent pattern of certain emotions being reported at certain stages. Something else that was quite interesting, typically emotion research focuses on individual level emotions. So what emotions is each person experiencing, and kind of their own individual appraisals of situations that cause them. So for instance, in this example here, each person in the group might be experiencing a different emotion. But there were also times that we found that students might also experience the same emotion, but it was still kind of at an individual level. So, for example, before the group activities, you know, students haven't really interacted with one another yet, but there was this common feeling of anxiety. So they all had this individual level of emotion, even though it's quite similar between students. We also found some evidence for more collective level of emotion. So, you know, there might be emotions that students experience that have kind of converged and synchronized with somebody else or other people in their group. So, for instance, in this example here, it might be that two people feel a bit frustrated that maybe the other two people in the group aren't contributing enough, and they've talked about it and discussed it, and that emotion seems to have converged and synchronized, and they're experiencing the same thing. And also, you know, more collective level of emotion after the activity's been completed. It was kind of identified a bit in a couple of the studies. For instance, after the group project's finished, there were occasions where students described how they celebrated together, and, you know, they kind of discussed their pleasant emotions of completing the task, and they were kind of sharing those emotions between each other. When I looked at the causes of emotions, there were 8 distinct categories where kind of causes fell into. So these were formulated through content analysis. And it was found that primarily emotions kind of stemmed from others, self, and the outcome. So for pleasant emotions, you know, the outcome of maybe submitting the work, the quality of the final piece of the work, or the grading of the activity was a real positive, and that created these pleasant emotions. Working with other people seemed to come out of a real cause for pleasant emotions. You know, sometimes students don't really get the opportunities to work like this with others during OU study. So, you know, the support they got, you know, their interaction with others was a great benefit. Unpleasant emotions were found to primarily stem from others and self categories. So others typically was that other students weren't really engaging and participating in the activity. And that was the most common cause of emotion found in this kind of research. And then there was these kind of self-related emotions. So, you know, a lack of confidence, increased anxiety before students take part. And that was, you know, a real common cause of emotion, an unpleasant emotion, kind of in the before and early stages of the activities. So looking at the impact, so as you might expect, students reported a lot of positive emotion words related to positive impacts, so pleasant emotions. And for kind of the negative impacts that emotions may have, there was a lot of unpleasant emotions mentioned, so such as anxiety and frustration. And what was quite interesting is that, you know, there was quite a few students highlighted that the emotion of anxiety and, to a lesser extent, frustration also had a positive impact in certain ways. So this included, you know, these emotions making them more engaged in the activity or helping drive their motivation to complete the task. And I've kind of come up with a few categories of the ways the emotions impacted students during the activities. So predominantly, students talked about how emotions impacted their behavioural engagement, whether that was for a positive or a negative impact. Also influences on their motivation and confidence as they're going through their work. Also, you know, emotions were found to a lesser extent, but also to impact the communication and working relationships between students. So, you know, the support and encouragement they offered one another, and also focus and attention. There was, you know, a few responses which highlighted that emotions did have a negative impact on students' health and well-being. This included, you know, increased physical symptoms, reduced sleep. Some students talked about how the emotions had a negative impact on their overall well-being. Okay, so when I tried to group together the ways in which students said they regulated their emotions, there were 5 categories that kind of stem from that. And predominantly, students said to kind of regulate their emotions and manage their feelings, they did this by kind of active task-related behaviour, so increasing effort in the task, increasing their work rate, maybe having more task-focused interactions with other people. And again, that might be whether they're experiencing unpleasant emotions quite a lot, but also, to try and maintain and increase pleasant emotions as well. Another more frequently described way of regulating students' emotions was by changing or directing their thoughts. So, this could have been focusing on the task more, thinking positively. It might be trying to not think about maybe the cause of the emotion they were experiencing if it was something that was unpleasant. And then the third category that was more highly described was social support. And this didn't just relate to people in the learning environment. So it often related to kind of the support they received from their tutor and other people in their group, but it also related to people outside of the learning environment, so family, friends. So they were sharing their kind of emotions about the group activity with those people, and they were gaining support there. The next group or category was modifying emotional responses, and I don't really like this title, but maybe it will change in the future. But it was kind of about students, taking time away, so specific breaks from the activity. I guess this is something which makes learning online at a distance quite different than maybe face-to-face environments. Students can just have these short breaks and then come back to the group activity. And it was also included things like going to do some exercise, listening to music, maybe having a short nap, something like that. And then there was kind of more maybe negative strategy, so avoiding, the situation, not taking part in the group activity, just kind of trying to forget about it. Was another strategy students use to regulate their emotions. Kind of looking at goals, so there were a number of goals why students tried to regulate their emotions during the activities, and these often related to performance aspects. So they might try and regulate their unpleasant emotions. They might try and remove those as that was having a negative impact on their performance in the activity, or they might try and increase, the experience of certain pleasant emotions because they thought they would have more positive impact on their participation and performance. Students also highlighted that, it was quite common for students to want to regulate and change their emotions because they didn't want to keep feeling a certain way. So if they were feeling maybe intense anxiety, they would say that the reason why they wanted to regulate their emotions were probably just to remove those feelings because they didn't like it. To a lesser extent, but still really important, was that there were students who identified that they tried to regulate their emotions for kind of social and relational oriented goals. So it might be that they try to regulate their emotions to be more accepted by group members or foster social relationships. So I think there are a few examples of students who were experiencing unpleasant emotions and they wanted to maybe express that to the group, but they didn't because they thought that would have a negative impact on their relationships with others in the team. Okay, so I know I've gone through that quite quickly, sorry about that. So now I'm kind of moving on to kind of creating these emotionally supportive learning environments, so maybe some things that could happen or maybe things that we could implement into design. I think one thing that could be done is just to increase that education to staff and students about emotions and emotion regulation and kind of their importance, but also how behaviours and emotions can influence others' emotions. So I think having kind of some education about the types of emotion experienced in these activities. We know they're quite highly emotionally charged compared to maybe some other aspects of study. What causes them, and then that can hopefully influence ways of supporting those, or maybe doing things to remove those causes, as well as understanding the impacts of emotions. Learning is obviously going to have ups and downs of emotions, and I think having a bit of an understanding of how if certain unpleasant emotions aren't persistent and maybe experienced at a too high level, they can have certain benefits, and those might be useful for other aspects of life. Also the strategies, so highlighting what are the positive strategies for regulating emotions. There's lots of different ways this can happen. Maybe also kind of maybe talking a little bit about those negative strategies, and maybe that's trying to steer students away from that, or I try to identify when students might be using these avoidance approaches. I think, like I said before, learning online has these affordances and constraints with emotion regulation, and there are some things, like I was saying, about taking the breaks, short breaks away from the task and then coming back, which can be really useful when learning online, which you can really do when you're face to face. But also when you're online, you don't really know how other people are feeling. If somebody wants to hide their emotions, it can be quite easy, especially as a lot of communication is asynchronous. I think that some talk about kind of the behaviours and actions, and how this can influence others. I think discussing on forums can sometimes be quite cold. It's often very task focused, and sometimes that emotion can be out come away from there. So maybe just talking about the language used, how supportive language behaviours can have a real positive impact on others, and that can stem positive emotions from other people. I think maybe also talking about this non-engagement in the activities. And some of the students highlighted they were just busy, so they didn't engage, but that would have caused some unpleasant emotions in other learners. So maybe some discussion about if you can't take part, if it's really important to really communicate it with the rest of the team and so you can come back at a later date. So it's just more aware, and there's that students maybe feel a bit more in control of what's going on. Similar to what I was talking about, there might also be this transmission or contagion of emotion. So if somebody's being extremely positive, that can have a positive influence on someone. So maybe one group member is a really positive member of the group, and their positivity can rub off on others. And I think this is also for tutors as well. So, if they come in with a real positive attitude, maybe not too much, but, being quite supportive, positive from the start, I think that might be able to benefit students. I know there's a couple of examples. I think the tutors, are really great in supporting students, the ones I spoke to, and a lot of the students' comments. But I think there was a couple of students' comments that highlighted that, some of the tutors thought that these group activities were the chance for students to kind of work on their own, and it's the chance for the tutor to step completely back. So they felt like that support wasn't there. Or I think there was one instance where the tutor said, "Oh, I know nobody likes group activities, but we've just got to get it done." So those type of things may be kind of starting from a bit of a negative foot, which could kind of transfer those feelings and emotions over to the students. Also, I think it's really important to try and enhance students' confidence, especially at the start of the activity, those feelings of control and interest in the task. So providing clear guidance instructions from, right from the get-go as far as possible, as maybe away from the activity, so as soon as the students start the module or even prior to that. Just letting students feel like they're in control a bit more of what they're doing, and they know the task, and they've got time to ask lots of questions. I think providing feedback from previous students, so it might be like little entries, blog entries, videos, just talking to students maybe through their experiences and highlighting the emotions they were experiencing. So maybe a bit anxious at the start, but during the project it was really enjoyable, and after it they really saw the benefits and they were really proud of what they'd done. I don't think any of the activities did this that I looked at, but I know they do at the OU, is that maybe it could be a chance to link the group activity, the assessed group activity, back to another task. And therefore it gives students already going into it with some material, and every student maybe feel like they can contribute from the start because they already have some information to put into the activity. Also, low stakes group activities or tasks where students can get used to working with one another, where it won't really count towards their module grade. Providing greater choice. I know at the OU, students are sometimes assessed with how they contribute in the forums, but sometimes that means that, the forum space can be very task focused. Students have worries about that they're being watched. So they're quite conscious of what they're putting in there. So I know students can go away and make their own groups, so maybe a little bit more information about that for students and the benefits of communicate in other groups and how the conversations might be quite different there. Yeah, so activities at a suitable time point. So I put this because, want to make sure that students have maybe had a chance to build relationships with others in the group, built up some trust in some people, and then they can go into the activity with that instead of maybe the group activity being quite early on in the module. Maybe placing the activity away from a holiday period or a period where maybe students are going to be really busy, so they might not be able to contribute as much. And then thinking about the length of the activity, so having it not too long. So, don't want an activity where students have got to complete the task in a week when they probably wouldn't even get to the chance to get to know other people in their group in that time. And also I put down just making sure they're interesting and valuable, trying to make it an authentic assessment, bringing in things they would do in their workplace, make it as engaging as possible. Now I'm kind of running out of time, but I'll try and get through these as quickly as I can. So the next recommendation is just trying to develop these feelings of relatedness and trust between group members and with the tutors. I don't mean they have to become best friends, but trying to develop some type of relationship and some trust between students would be great before going into kind of an assessed group task. And that can be through icebreakers or these low-stake group activities, using other platforms for students to get to know one another, with their tutor, maybe making it a bit more personal with telephone calls or letting the students see the tutor more visibly. Also, maybe providing opportunities for students to discuss their feelings about the group activities, whether that's a specific space where they could do it. Obviously, that could hopefully, if it was supported right, could be quite a positive thing and not turn into something that's very negative. But trying to build up those support networks where students can maybe feel like they can go back to and help manage their feelings as they're going through the task. Even in the tutorial, maybe before the activity, there could be some anonymous survey about how people are feeling, and then there could be some short discussion about that and maybe ways to kind of support one another as the activities progress. So just a couple of more points. So I've got maybe study buddies could be something which could be implemented. So it could be an experienced student. Proactive tutor support. This was something that was mentioned quite a lot anyway, but just making sure tutors identify those students who may be experiencing difficulties and maybe these persistent unpleasant emotions. And maybe the use of tools. I know Tim Coughlin and Kate Lister kind of developed our journey. There's lots of other tools which have been developed for trying to make students more aware of their emotions and prompt kind of more positive regulation. So I know in TM255 we've used real-time student feedback to do that, and students can say how they're feeling and then try and prompt ways if they want to regulate those emotions. Also maybe opportunities for celebration, reflection and closure. Sometimes a few of the students talked about how the group activity finished and they just moved on to the next thing. There was no kind of end point, clear end point. So somewhere where, if they are experiencing negative emotions, those can be kind of stopped at that point, some closure. If they are experiencing pleasant emotions, they get a chance to celebrate that with all their other group members and, try and let those positive emotions kind of ride on a little bit further. I won't go through all of these, but if I share slides at some point, these are just some of the key points related in those recommendations that could be related to kind of creating a well-designed activity of a high quality. I'll leave those there probably so people can see them for a bit longer, but yeah, that's everything I've got to say. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Unfortunately, the colleagues cannot make it today and they apologize. And thank you to Jake, who kind of introduced the topic of assessment, because we have some similarities in relation to students' emotions about online exams. So this presentation will be about the Open University student satisfaction and barriers to taking online remote exams. And this was a study, a joint study between the Quality Enhancement and Innovation in IT and the assessment program. So in today's presentation, we will talk about the reasons of conducting this study. Then I will present the study and our findings, and then hopefully we will get the chance to discuss as to what these findings mean for the Open University. For those who want to actually read the work, it has been published a couple of days ago in conference proceedings. I am adding the link into the chat. So a few words about online exams. As many of you know, during the pandemic, many universities, including us, have moved from face-to-face exams to online exams. And some students liked it, some others didn't like it. Academics were confused as to how to do this transition from face-to-face to online exams. And there were some studies focusing on this experience. So what we know is that students more or less were satisfied with the new online exam system, especially in particular because it's more flexible and more convenient to them. They were having more time to prepare. Some of them thought that it was a more accessible type of exam. And of course, these were feelings that students had even before the pandemic. So we get to find them before the pandemic as well. So there were some challenges, and there are some challenges during the online exams, and these are mainly of technological nature. So students complain about not being able to do the exam because they have slow internet connection. They may have lack of access to necessary technology, for example, having to scan their assignment and then send it off. Or they have lack of technical knowledge. They may not be aware that they can just, take a picture of their assignment instead of having a scanner, and then how to upload that picture. Of course, there were some well-being factors as well, especially for students who are used to have this face-to-face interaction with their tutor or with the examiner. They felt overwhelmed and anxious during the exam because they had nobody to ask if there was a question or there was a problem. This experience was different between students in different groups. For example, we have disabled students who tend to be happier about choosing the location of their exam and not having to move to an exam center. Some of them were happy when having a software that would allow them to adjust the font size and the colors. Especially for open book exams, students thought that they had more time to read the assessment, write and review the questions. But again, there were reports about feeling isolated and requiring more support. When it comes to students from Black, Asian or minority ethnicities, it was reported that they had lower access to technology, they had less access to tutoring and support, and lower levels of confidence with technology. And also there were some differences between female and male students, with female students being more anxious and having lower self-efficacy when it comes to online exams. And this is mainly because they felt they had less control over the exams and less access to resources. So because of all of these, and because we also experienced this situation of having to move from face-to-face to online exams at the Open University, we thought that there isn't any literature on distance learning universities, and we need to understand what happens with our students during that transition. So we ran this study, which is part of a series of studies conducted by assessment program and is contributing to ongoing discussion and decisions about the Open University moving to an online exams model. And in this particular study, we're looking at whether students were satisfied with what we have done and what barriers we will need to address as university to make this experience better for them, since we decided to move to that online remote exams model. So some context about the Open University. Most of you are part of the Open University, but I am just going to summarize what the Open University is doing overall and in relation to online exams, So at the Open University, we deliver the courses through our VLEs, through online tutorials and small tutor groups. Although we do most of the things online, our exams were taking place in designated exam centers until before the pandemic. However, we only had 24% of the courses having a final exam. Most of the other courses had an end of module exam. So these 24% courses had to have a final exam in an online version, and that had to happen very fast. So the face-to-face exams were replaced with online exams, and these were different according to the school, the subject, the faculty, and each team decided what is best for their students and their assessment. And they provided also different submission windows. So some students had 2 hours to submit their assignments, some others had 7 days, and it was a more open book style assessment. What we wanted to figure out was what elements students are satisfied with when it comes to online exams, what barriers do they think they will have if they take online exams, and whether there were any significant differences between student groups. As we mentioned earlier, we saw that online exams benefited some student groups more and some student groups less. So we ran a survey with OU undergraduate students across faculties. And in this survey, we included mainly 2 instruments. One instrument was the satisfaction instrument, and it was the reuse of the CFAR instrument. CFAR is a study that takes place at the Open University every few years and is focusing on the student experience of feedback, assessment, and revision. And we enriched the CFAR instrument with other elements that we consider very important, especially during the pandemic and post-pandemic period, which are anxiety, as Jake expanded earlier, and exam preparedness. The second instrument was the barrier instrument, and we constructed that instrument based on open-ended responses we received from students about their assessment during the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic, and via the COVID-19 project that we ran. So for the satisfaction instrument, we had a 5-item Likert scale, and for the barrier instrument, we had a multiple selection question. And finally, we also retrieved demographics about students to make feasible some comparison between the student groups. So you can see the sample and demographics. This study took place in 2 phases, phase 1 and phase 2, but phase 1 was more exploratory. So I am going to present findings from phase 2 that collected 562 responses. And out of this number, we had 190 students who had experience with online exams. We still wanted to survey everybody because we wanted to also have an idea of what students who have never had an online exam think about online exams, because they may take them in the future. The sample was quite representative when it comes to the different groups, and we had lots of representation from students with declared disability and students from Black, Asian, and minority ethnicities. So for the data analysis, to understand student satisfaction, we only used the student responses who had experiences with online exams, while for the barriers question, we used all student responses, as students who haven't had experience may also identify some barriers they may have in the future if they have to take online exams. We visualized these 2 different instruments, and finally we ran some chi-square tests to understand the differences between the groups, for example, whether there were differences between male, female, or students with disabilities and without. So as you can see in this Likert scale, we have all the different statements and elements of satisfaction. And in the colorful bars, you can see the extent to which students agreed or disagreed with each element. At the top, you can see the statements that students agreed the most. And the first two statements are related to the environment that they took the exam. So they were quite satisfied with the environment they took the exam because they found a quiet space and they were satisfied with the quality of that space. And then other elements that students were quite satisfied with had to do with the type of exam, whether students thought it was a good quality exam that allowed them to demonstrate their knowledge. The exam questions were clear and they felt that sense of achievement. At the bottom, the element that they were least satisfied with, it was about enjoying the exam. But as Jake explained, it's not very common that students enjoy having an exam. So we thought that wasn't in particular related to having online exams, but to have exams in general. But still, another element that students were least satisfied with was about that they agreed the least. It was about feeling anxious. So again, we can see that, you know, they may feel less anxious if they are giving online exams instead. But overall, we can see from the blue and the green color that students were quite satisfied with most of the online exams element. So some differences between the student groups. First of all, Black, Asian, and minority ethnicity students were less likely to feel prepared immediately before starting the exam compared to white students. And female students felt that with this type of exam, they were less likely to demonstrate what they learned. Also, students with declared disabilities were less likely to be satisfied with the mark they received and the quality of the environment they had for their exam. Moving to question 2 about the barriers they had or they think they will have when taking online exams at home. This is the list of statements that we provided them with, and at the top again you can see the statements that students selected the most, and the most selected were relevant to having employment commitments or constraints, and also something that we saw a lot with BRIC university students. It was about having technical difficulties, having the fear of having technical difficulties or not having a good internet connection. There were, of course, other barriers like lack of quiet working space, childcare responsibilities, mental health issues, confidence setting up using the technology, access to internet connection, other caring responsibilities, physical disability or household competition for access to devices. Again, these barriers were different to each student group. For example, we can see that female students were more likely to report that they were less confident with setting up the technology and dealing with technical difficulties. And they also mentioned some mental health issues, which, as they explained, they were more anxious about all this transition and not having someone to talk with if there was a problem. And students with declared disabilities, again, they mention about having physical disability as a barrier to taking online exams or having other caring responsibilities. So some discussion we had between the quality enhancement and innovation group and the assessment program around our findings were that we can see that there are high levels of satisfaction overall with online exams, and in particular with the environment that they have for taking the exams, but also they were happy with the actual exam, the procedure, the type of exams, and the clarity of questions. Students, though, were still anxious during the exam, and some of them thought that it was harder than expected, and they thought that tutors made it on purpose harder because online exams sounds like an easy thing to do, so we make it harder for you. And then we also noticed having some students reporting employment difficulties and childcare responsibilities, which is different to students in big universities. And this is because we have older students as well with other kind of responsibilities. And of course, the technical difficulties, again, although our students are studying using learning technologies, when it comes to exam, they get anxious about the technology that they have to use during the exam, and they are afraid of having any unexpected issues with the software or their internet. When it comes to student groups, again, as we saw from big universities, we have the same finding here, that it can be beneficial for some groups and for some others less beneficial. We saw across the two different versions, the two different fields, topics that we studied, the satisfaction and the barriers, that female students experienced more issues, or they thought they will experience more issues, and that's mainly because of their lack of confidence and feeling anxious. Also, students with declared disabilities may feel that they are not they don't have the right technologies probably to take exams at home, or their environment at home is not the best. And finally, students feeling unprepared and needing more support. So to have an overall reflection, our students do have high levels of satisfaction with online exams. They also face some barriers, or they think they will face some barriers, and that is mainly because they are of higher average age. So, for example, they may have to go at work on the day of the exam, or they may have caring responsibilities, or these two make it difficult because they may need to stay at home with children, having to take the exam and having a lot of noise in the house. Then across all the things that we examined, there was like an evident lack of confidence with technology, and mainly dealing about unexpected issues, although our students are more familiar with the learning technologies that the OU is using. So all these issues can be manageable, and we don't really require high-tech technologies, but we need to be more prepared, and also to get our students to be more prepared about having this type of exams. And some suggestions would be to familiarize students throughout their studies with the technologies that we're planning to get them to use for their assessment. So when it comes to the final exam, they are already familiar with the technologies, and they don't have all this anxiety and lack of confidence with how they are going to use this technology. But also we have other issues to look at. For example, whether we're going to use assistive technologies for students who may have a declared disability, and how we can integrate this in the assessment system. As Jake mentioned earlier, TIM is already doing that with our students with declared disabilities. So we need to find ways to integrate this extra support into our assessment processes as well. And thank you. I'm sure you must be having some questions or comments, as it's quite relevant to most of us about the new model.